Today's video is sponsored by Audible. I read so many scary stories sometimes that I struggle to find time to read for pleasure on my own. That's where Audible comes in. To kick off 2020, they're focusing on New Year, New You. They have plenty of content that can help you pursue your goals, whether it's getting fit, finishing more books, or becoming a better parent, leader, or person. Audiobooks on the go from Audible lets me listen at the gym, while shopping, in the car, or while traveling when I otherwise would be trapped in the continuous paranoid thoughts of these spooky stories. And they're not just audiobooks, as they have podcasts, guided wellness programs, theatrical performances, A-list comedy, and exclusive Audible originals you won't find anywhere else. Starting a free 30-day Audible trial lets you choose 1 audiobook and 2 Audible originals. And like I said, it's totally free. I've been tearing through Chase Darkness with Me by Billy Jensen, an Audible original about a true crime writer who actually starts solving real-life murders. Visit audible.com/readcreepy to get started on your 30-day free trial, plus 1 audiobook and 2 free Audible originals. That's audible.com/readcreepy, or text READCREEPY to 500-500. This is the worst thing that has ever happened to me. My ex-boyfriend betrayed me by giving away all of my secrets to the creepiest person I've ever come in contact with. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This took place about a year ago, and I still have to deal with some of the consequences. I'm a 19-year-old girl, and I go to college about 2 hours away from my house. I got a full ride, and I love making YouTube videos in my free time. I would create makeup tutorials and things like that. I started when I was like 16 or 17, and I gradually built up a small following. It wasn't enough that I was a celebrity or anything, but it was enough that I didn't have to work a part-time job outside of college to have money. To be honest, it was really nice. The only real drawback was that I had a couple of really creepy guys that would always comment on my videos and stalk my internet profile. Thankfully, I didn't use my real name online, and I never shot videos in places that could be recognized or tracked. I met my first boyfriend while I was in college. It was a couple of weeks into our chemistry class, and we ended up being assigned partners to each other. He seemed really nice, and things just went from there. I dated him for the rest of that semester, and a few weeks into the semester, I started to notice that we weren't the most compatible people. We had extremely different interests and different goals for what we wanted out of life. I tried talking to him about these concerns of mine, but he didn't really care. Most of the time he wouldn't even talk to me because he was too busy playing video games. The night that he had told me he'd rather play Fortnite than talk about our relationship problems, I knew that I had to break up with him. There was no way this was going to work. Thankfully, we didn't have many classes together, so it wouldn't be all that painful to be broken up. I figured that I was going to drop the class that I had with him since I didn't really need it. It was a pretty basic sociology class, and I was taking way more credit hours than I needed. I talked to him after class that day and told him that I didn't think we were compatible and that we should look for other people. He seemed really hurt by this. It was really surprising. I told him numerous times that there were problems between us and that I wanted to get to the bottom of them. He never made time to work with me on them, but now all of a sudden, I want to break up and I'm the bad guy. If any of you have been in a situation like this, you can understand how frustrating it can be. I just walked away after I said my piece, leaving him pretty frustrated and upset. He texted me a few times later that day, but I just blocked his number. I eventually blocked him on all social media, and I dropped the class that night. He would be out of my life, I thought to myself. Just a few weeks later, I was having coffee at a coffee shop that was pretty popular in town. I had my favorite white chocolate mocha, and I was just casually scrolling on my phone replying to comments on my YouTube videos. This is when a really strange-looking guy in a dark green jacket walked up to me. He stood over me and just kind of looked at me for a second. I felt his presence immediately and looked up away from my phone to see him staring at me dead on. I got really intimidated and asked him, "Can I help you?" He just smiled and said, "You're even prettier in real life." I had no idea what he was talking about. What? He then proceeded to tell me that he was a fan of my YouTube channel. I found this extremely strange considering that he was a guy who obviously didn't wear makeup. But it was also strange because I had never been recognized in real life before. I had about 62,000 subscribers. Sure, most of my subscribers and viewers were Americans, but it's such a small number of people that the odds of being noticed in public are extremely rare for an audience of this size. I started thinking about the odds of some creepy older guy watching my makeup tutorials, being a fan, and just happening to find me in public one day, and how it all seemed extremely bizarre. He began touching my arm and asked me if I was a lonely little girl who needed some company. I pulled my arm away, splashed my coffee in his face, and ran to the ladies' room. I waited there for a little while. I texted some of my friends to come to the coffee shop and check if he was still outside waiting for me. They had probably gotten there about 10 minutes later and said that there was definitely a creepy guy in a dark green jacket still sitting around looking in the direction of the bathrooms. I felt my stomach drop. I asked them to talk to the staff to see if they could make him leave. I don't know how exactly what they did, but they texted me and told me he was gone within a few minutes. I told them the whole story and they were extremely confused, even more so than I was. A couple of weeks later, a friend of mine who was still friends with my ex-boyfriend saw him bragging about how he totally got revenge on me. I guess he had gone into the comments section on one of my YouTube videos and found one of those creepy guys. He messaged them and had given them all of my real-life information. My friends said that he had made it sound like he had done this with multiple guys, meaning that there are potentially more of them out there looking for me right now. It still really freaks me out and makes me question what kind of monster I had been dating after all. Who gives a person's information out like that to strangers on the internet, no less? I understand if he was upset about me breaking up with him, but I feel like I was within my right to break up with him. It didn't give him the right to do that to me. Within a few weeks, I had to move apartments, which was extremely expensive mid-semester, but I didn't want to take the chance that one of these creepy guys was going to show up at my house, considering that my ex-boyfriend knew where I lived. I made sure to protect myself as best as I could, but I still have to worry now. After that whole experience, I don't tell anyone that I have a small YouTube channel, and as much as my channel has grown since then, I have still not been recognized in public by anyone else, and hopefully, it stays that way. I know how most of these stalker stories play out. It's normally an attractive young woman and some creepy guy that doesn't get the hint. But I have a stalker story that's probably the most horrifying stalker story I know of. It's the worst story I've ever heard about. Not because there's some grand monster, some horribly deranged psychopath killer. There's no cult. There's no aliens or Bigfoot or monsters or anything like that. But it's 100% true, and to make matters worse, it happens to people that I know and interact with every single day. So I don't know about you, but that's what makes this the scariest story I've ever heard. It goes like this. I have a special needs uncle. He talks a little funny and doesn't quite understand the way the world works. We all kind of think of him as a 5-year-old in an adult's body. Physically, he's about 60, very wrinkled, bald, and unkempt in a way you could mistake him for being homeless. He's honestly incredibly nice and has a heart of gold. The only thing wrong with him is that he's not mentally functional. He's a little strange, too. I'm not really sure he's uniquely strange given his circumstances, but when there's only one mentally handicapped person in your life, they kind of stick out like a sore thumb. We call him Uncle Steve. It's been my father's responsibility to take care of him ever since my grandparents passed away, and he's always lived in the house with us. Thankfully, we've been able to have a large enough house that he has his own room and it's never been too burdensome. At least not from what I remember. Taking care of a mentally handicapped person can be a lot, but it's never been too much if that makes sense. Well, he would ride his bike around our local community and do little things like pick up stuff from the grocery store or go to the local deli. It was pretty nice to have that help growing up, but sometimes he would disappear for long periods of time and we would all be worried about him. I remember when cell phones became commonplace, my dad started sending him out with his cell phone so that whenever we got worried, we could call him from my mom's phone or our house phone. You see, that didn't quite work out. He just wouldn't answer his phone if he was riding his bike for whatever reason. It didn't matter what we said to him. Maybe he just didn't hear it with the wind blowing against his ears. My dad started getting suspicious that he was doing something that he didn't want us knowing about. I must have been around 17 or 18 years old at the time. I remember it was when I was first able to start driving around. My father asked me to borrow one of my friend's cars and follow him around to see what he was up to around the community, just to be sure that he wasn't doing something bad. I agreed and followed him for an entire afternoon. This guy literally rode his bike around the local park for like 3 hours. It was honestly really strange. I guess little activities like that become much more exciting for people of his mental capacity. Not to knock him, but unfortunately I felt like this was the highlight of his day. Well, I told my dad about it and he asked me to do it one more time. He promised to pay me $50 for my trouble and to keep it to myself. I don't know why he was so suspicious about Uncle Steve, but I agreed. I followed him just like I did the day before, but this time, when he was riding in the direction of the park, he made a turn that I didn't expect. I almost lost him because I just thought he was going back to the park again to ride around for hours again. I slowly followed him as he rode down the street that I've never been on before. He came in front of this one house and parked his bike on the sidewalk. I parked my car across the street so I could watch him. He began walking toward the house. He got up near the front door and tried walking inside. I guess the door was locked, so he opens one of the windows and climbs inside. At this point, I was extremely freaked out. I had no idea what to do. Do I call the police? I was afraid someone was going to hurt him. He was just this mentally handicapped old guy after all. I can imagine that it must have been horrifying to find him inside of your house unwelcome. After a few minutes of sitting there in awe, he climbs back out the window, closed it behind him, got back on his bike and rode away. I drove back home and called my dad's workplace from the house phone. I told him what I had seen and he left work immediately. I always hated watching my uncle get disciplined because it made me feel bad for him even though I knew that he needed to be disciplined like a child. It was just a weird situation and I never really got used to that. So I went out with my friends that night and figured I would just find out what happened the next day. When I got home the next morning, my father told me that Uncle Steve had been institutionalized and I'm never going to see him again. I was shocked. "You institutionalized him?" I yelled. My dad told me to sit down, and then he told me something that I would never forget. I guess he had searched my uncle's room before and found a black box that had hair in it. It was a girl's hair. I guess he had been breaking into this family's house during the day and stealing belongings from their daughter, like hair on her pillow or underwear and even things like tissues. It was really creepy and disturbing. The creepiest part is knowing that this girl went to the same high school as me. But she wasn't my age, she was 14 years old. Uncle Steve must have seen her in the community one day and had taken a liking to her. I don't know how he figured out where she lived, but he did and found a way inside multiple times. My father told me that this wasn't the first time that he had been creeping on young girls. A couple of years back, Uncle Steve had become friends with a teenage girl in our local community. She spent time with him because she felt sorry for him or something like that, but things escalated when he tried kissing her in front of her parents. After word had gotten back to my dad, the girl's parents threatened to press assault charges. The only reason they didn't was because their daughter talked them out of it. I guess after that, my parents did everything they could to keep Uncle Steve on a short leash. but you can only control someone like that so much. I wasn't sure what to think of the whole situation when it was all said and done. I feel bad for him knowing that he's going to suffer the rest of his life in a rubber room or whatever, but it's also not fair to put girls at risk for his sake. The reason I find the story so scary is that even the most innocent-seeming people in your life can turn out to be monsters and creeps, and that's why it's the scariest story I've ever heard. I've always been a fan of horror stories and true crime, which is why it was so strange to have my own experience. So a little background on me. I'm a 21-year-old male college student. I attend a local community college and live at home. My local area includes garbage pickup, but here's the problem. We have a really big piece of property. Our driveway is a good long walk from the house itself. We normally throw garbage into the garbage cans that are just outside of our house, and then on garbage days, I have to take the garbage cans all the way down near the road so the garbage man gets them. It's a little bit of an inconvenience, but it's not the end of the world. Some of my friends have to bring their own garbage to the local garbage dump, and I'm just happy I don't have to put any of this trash in my car. If you're a college student, you probably understand the struggle of maintaining a healthy sleep schedule. If I'm going to be honest with you, I don't really have one. I kind of sleep when I'm tired, and I'm awake when I'm not. Sometimes I get my schoolwork done early in the morning, like 3 a.m., and at times it's in the afternoon after class. It really just depends. My horror story begins with me bringing down the garbage cans late at night. What almost always happens is that I don't remember to bring down the cans until the night before, at like 11 p.m. or sometimes later. This means that I'm making multiple trips back and forth carrying heavy garbage cans in the pitch black. I mentioned that I like horror earlier, but I don't consider myself to be someone that's scared easily. Neither night nor darkness scares me very much. I've had a few experiences where I'll hear noises or imagine that I see something out of the corner of my eye, but it's never been anything horrible. I never imagined that I'd have a bad experience carrying the garbage cans until this last summer. It must have been about 2 a.m. and I was moving a really heavy can of trash. It felt like it was at least 70 pounds, full of kitty litter. Why, you might ask? My family has 5 cats. Don't even ask. They wouldn't have been an issue, but all of this kitty litter was in the worst trash can that we have. The wheels both fell off, and the handlebar rips off sometimes if you pull it too hard. So I was pulling this ridiculously heavy garbage can full of kitty litter that stinks to high heavens. I get about halfway down my driveway, and the handlebar rips off. The entire can fell over, and at least 1/3 of everything came out into the driveway. I cursed under my breath and just stood there for a moment, wondering what I was going to do. There was honestly a big pile of dirty kitty litter here now. My best idea was to sweep it back into the trash can, so I started making my way back up the driveway. I didn't walk very far before something possessed me to stop and turn around. I had this strange feeling that I was being watched. I turned my head and looked to see a light coming from my neighbor's house. And all the time that I've been doing the garbage at night, I've never seen this neighbor up that late before. I was pretty sure it was an older man. He had to have been at least 60. So it was kind of a surprise to see a light on in his house. It was on the 2nd floor, maybe his bedroom window. His house was on the other side of the road, and it must have been about 10 feet away from the road, so it was a good distance between me and him. I just remember feeling really freaked out that there was someone else awake and watching me. What possible reason could he have been awake at 2 in the morning? I stood there for a moment wondering to myself. I was just kind of staring at the window. Again, there was a good bit of distance, and I couldn't see all too clearly, but I felt my heart drop when I saw him walk away from the window. I wasn't exactly sure, but the way he moved made me think that he was standing at his window watching me. He didn't turn on his light, and I didn't see him at the window anymore. I tried telling myself that he was just an old man, and I must have woken him up by dropping this garbage can. I got the broom, started sweeping the kitty litter back into the garbage can, and then brought it next to the road. I felt his eyes on me the rest of the night, even after he turned down his light, and that was the night everything changed. Every time I ever did the garbage after that point, I noticed him watching. I even started mixing up the times when I would bring the garbage down, and it didn't matter if it was at 2 p.m. or 2 a.m., he would be there, watching. It was around this time that I also noticed that there must have been a different garbage man. The old guy used to get the garbage out of the can and throw the garbage can itself and the lid on the ground in a really sloppy way. I didn't really blame him. It must suck to be a garbage man, but I did appreciate that this new guy was making the effort to put the lid back on the garbage can neatly. It makes my life easier to just grab them and bring them back to the house. This was a pleasant change, but it didn't calm my nerves one bit from being watched. I started getting really freaked out. I asked my parents about what I should do, and they told me I was just being paranoid, that he was an older, retired gentleman that probably doesn't have anything better to do. If I'm going to be honest with you, I don't care how bored or unoccupied someone's time is. I don't think there's a person on earth that would go out of their way to watch their neighbor take out the garbage if there wasn't some kind of reason for it. This went on for the rest of the summer and into the next semester. I started getting frustrated with the whole situation. It still made me feel really uneasy. I read about stalking laws to see if I could report him for something. I really couldn't do anything because he never actually left his own property. He just always happened to be around when I started moving the garbage. Fall break came around and I decided that I was going to make a change. I was going to watch him instead. My bedroom just happened to be on the side of the house that I could see his house from my bedroom window. I found a pair of binoculars in the basement, and after bringing the garbage down at 4 a.m. one night, I got situated next to the window and began watching this old man. He didn't turn out his bedroom light like usual, and it seems like he was just sitting there. A half hour must have gone by before I started getting really sleepy. This guy was just sitting here, watching the garbage. I was just about to go to bed when I noticed he left his bedroom. I tried paying attention to see if any of the other lights would turn on in his house, but he didn't seem to turn any of them on. I looked closely to notice any kind of changes. About 40 seconds went by and I thought that I had completely lost him. I didn't see him anywhere. I just concluded that he was some kind of schizophrenic freak and this was a waste of my time. Before putting the binoculars down, I looked down at the garbage pail, and I noticed that they were gone. I got really confused for a minute and had no idea what was going on. I waited a few more minutes to see that the old man was carrying what looked like my garbage cans out from his own house. He placed them exactly where they had been before. I waited about 40 minutes for him to go to bed. I was only sure that he was asleep after the light in his bedroom went out. I rushed down to the garbage cans and was shocked when I noticed that they were completely empty. That was when it hit me. We never got a new garbage man. This guy actually started stealing our trash, and he must have been emptying it in his own house for whatever reason. This made me really freaked out, and honestly, I had no idea what to do about it. I started driving the trash to the dump just to avoid having to bring those garbage cans down. A couple of weeks of doing that, and I noticed that the old man seems to be less active around his house. I'm too scared to confront him directly. I don't know what he's trying to do, but it still freaks me out to this day. I'm a 22-year-old woman. I live in your typical small American town. I own a small house right across the street from my parents, and the rest of my family lives within a mile. We're all really close, and I really like living this way. Our family is pretty well connected with the local community, but this comes with its good and with its bad. Small-town gossip is notorious for being a plague of people's lives, and after having been on the receiving end of some of that small-town gossip, I can confirm that it really sucks. There's this one guy that lives in my community, and he has a bit of a reputation for being a creep. We went to the same high school, but he was 2 grades above mine. We never had any kind of interaction while we were in high school, but he messaged me on Facebook this one time and asked me if I was single. Being a woman, I know exactly what he was after by cold messaging me one day on Facebook like that. All that I knew about him was that he was considered a creep by quite a few people. Now, I'm normally not the kind of person that buys into these kinds of rumors, but when there's smoke, there's usually fire. After reading the message, I simply ignored him. This prompted him to message me like 4 more times, asking why I read the message and didn't reply. After reading these other messages, I told him that I was not interested in dating him, and that I knew that he was just trying to be a creep. He called me a sexist for thinking that men only want one thing, and I almost found this a little humorous. He tried telling me that he just wanted to be my friend because he had heard that I was a funny person. I decided that I'd play along with it and accepted his friend request. We talked a couple more times on Facebook Messenger, and he honestly had some interesting thoughts. We talked about movies and some of the local gossip of our small town. We didn't talk regularly or anything, but when we did, he was always the one that initiated the conversation. Quite frankly, I had enough friends and was really close with my family, so it's not like I really needed anyone else in my life to keep me company. A couple of weeks after knowing him on Facebook at least, he spotted me in Walmart. He said hi and wanted to take a selfie together. Of course, he posted it to Facebook and tagged me for the whole town to see. So, there we were, standing in front of the cucumbers in our local Walmart. He had this goofy-looking grin on his face, and I had a very obvious fake smile. He commented on his own picture, tagged me in the comment, and wrote that I looked so beautiful. He had one of those heart eye emojis, and I officially started to feel kind of freaked out. Buckle your seatbelt, kids, because it gets even worse. I don't know how, but he got my phone number somehow and started to text me. At this point, I was feeling really freaked out, but there was also a part of me that felt bad for this guy. I knew that he had no friends, and this was the only way that he was interacting with people other than his family, probably. And even then, his family had a reputation for being drunken misfits, so maybe he didn't have anyone. I asked him how he got my number, and he told me that he messaged one of my other friends on Facebook and asked them for it. This was the moment that I knew that he was being sneaky in addition to creepy. He knew that if he had asked me directly, I would have said no and probably would have blocked him. I asked my one friend who gave him my number, Alexis, and she told me that she had figured it was okay because we had public pictures together on Facebook. Of course, she was talking about the Walmart picture. That's when I started feeling really frustrated with the whole thing. I stopped responding to his Facebook messages, and I only replied to his text messages when he double texted me at once. Honestly, I know this is the point that I should have just blocked him altogether, but I didn't quite understand the severity of this guy's mental illness just yet. He started getting the hint that I wasn't all too interested in chatting with him, and he began messaging me less. That was until one day he sent me a random picture message. I had been in our local car show, and it was kind of a big deal in our town, and it was a picture of me. It was very obvious that he'd been across the street from where I was standing and talking with someone. He told me that I looked beautiful and that he wished that I would talk to him more. I really didn't know how to respond. I just ignored his text message. But when it started happening frequently, he would Facebook message me or text me and send me pictures of myself that he had taken without me knowing. And it would be really strange places too. While I was parked at a red light, coming out from the dentist, randomly around town, I knew that something was wrong, and I told myself that I was eventually going to go to the police about this because it got really out of hand. I kind of figured that if I just ignored him, though, the problem would just go away on its own. Of course, that's never how it works. The final straw was when he took a picture of me playing Guitar Hero with my sister. We were literally in our house in the living room. He must have been across the street and zoomed in with his phone and looked through the window to see us playing. When I saw that picture message, I literally dropped my phone and screamed. I told my dad everything that had happened, and he immediately asked me why I let it go on for so long. I told him that I didn't really know, but I just wanted it to stop. He told me to block him on Facebook and block his phone number and anywhere else he could possibly reach me. He went over to his house that night. I don't know exactly what he said, but he told me that I wouldn't be hearing from him again anytime soon. After this whole experience, I never to talk to anyone that I don't personally know that well, especially when it comes to social media or texting. It's just way too easy to creep on someone and then become obsessed with me. And if you're curious, my dad didn't hurt him or anything like that. I still see this creep around town sometimes, but thankfully, he doesn't even look in my direction. This is probably the worst stalker story that I know, but it didn't actually happen to me. It happened to my aunt. Throughout me and my cousin's time in school, there was never enough supplies for the humanities. If you know anything about the way public school funding works, you know that almost all of the budget goes to sports, and primarily football. There are very few opportunities for students to pursue things like artwork or other creative projects because the funding just isn't there. Those crazy football dads make sure their NFL wannabe star can have enough money to practice with the best equipment and whatnot. I come from a very artistic family, and on top of that, me and all of my cousins are girls. None of us played very many sports, and we all focused on things like music and art with our free time. Year after year, there was never enough money in the budget for us to get supplies to work with. But there was always an abundance of funding for the football kids and even the cheerleaders. When I was in high school, and some of my cousins were in high school and middle school, my aunt finally had enough of the broken system and decided to run for the school board. She wanted to make sure that students could have the opportunity to pursue the humanities. She was friends with the woman who was in her position before her, who just so happened to be retiring, and she promised to endorse my aunt. And as you might expect, it wasn't all that hard to get elected to the school board after that. My aunt did everything she could to play by the rules and to even be fair for all students. It's not like she just showed up and slashed the football budget in half. She did everything fairly and evenly. But many of the school coaches and football dads did not take kindly to her approach. There were regular fights at the school board meetings, and they started making it out like she was an anti-football person. Some coaches even called her anti-American. Despite all of the chaos, she stood her ground and things went pretty well. She was on the school board making decisions for about 10 years. The job didn't pay a whole lot, but she was able to ensure that students could pursue extracurricular activities other than football and cheerleading. After a couple of years, she decided that she actually wanted to work within the school system. She was tired of her job and wanted something new. After asking around in the town, someone told her that there was going to be an open position for a head administrator in the high school. She was totally qualified for the position and really wanted to get it. This meant that she was not able to stay on the school board as there would be a conflict of interest. Honestly, I don't entirely understand why, but that was one of the rules for accepting the job. Well, one of the coaches who really disliked her said quite a few nasty things to her over the last few years. The one that called her anti-American. He told her that she wouldn't be able to win her last election before accepting the administration job. She went out of her way to prove him wrong and won the election only to resign 3 weeks later to get that job. Of course, you can understand how this infuriated this guy. It finally got to him, and for some reason he decided to destroy my aunt's car one day in the parking lot. Her first week on the job as an administrator, she went out to the parking lot to find her car with smashed windows and slashed tires. Of course, the security tape malfunctioned that day, so there was no evidence as to who did it, but everyone knew it was him. But unfortunately, there wasn't any evidence at the time. There were a few other incidents like that, things going missing from my aunt's desk and little things that he could do to make her life more difficult. There was even one incident when he had accused her of messing with a student's file on purpose to get back at him. The student was the backup quarterback on the football team, and he claimed that my aunt was messing with his file and changing his grades to make him fail classes. Honestly, I'm really surprised the entire ordeal went on for as long as it did. I don't even know everything that he had done, but just from the things that I had heard about him, I have no idea how this guy was allowed to be a teacher and a coach in the high school I attended. And throughout this entire ordeal, my aunt was regularly receiving death threats and hate mail at least once per week. He always used different fonts or email addresses to make it look like it was a bunch of different people, but there were enough similarities that anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together knew it was probably this coach. It finally came to a head one day about 2 years later. My cousins and I, along with my aunt and my mom, were all around our house getting ready to go to the local swimming pool after school one day. We had been packing sunscreen and pool toys in the minivan when, all of a sudden, a truck that I didn't recognize pulled up in our driveway. My aunt yelled at all of us kids to get into the house, and I heard some screaming. She didn't tell us exactly what had happened that day, and it would be years before I would find out what did. So, I guess he had been sending her threatening messages anonymously on her phone. My aunt started carrying her handgun on her person since she had a carry permit. The day he drove to the house, he began walking up to her before she pulled her gun on him, and he stopped and turned around and ran away. He got back in his truck and drove off. I guess she had reported the incident to the school system, and he was fired without much of a fight. I don't know what he does these days. I just hope it's somewhere very far away from football and children. I've always had a philosophy about life. I've always believed that good people finish last, that it always seems to be the bad guys who are winning. I don't want to be right about this. I just am. Unfortunately, the world is just an ugly place where the worst kinds of people almost always happen to be the ones that manage to claw themselves to the top. The only person that I knew of that really went against the grain was my best friend in high school. Let's call her Lola. She was a bleeding heart empath who always tried to do the right thing. Lola had the strongest moral compass I've ever seen on a human being. I had never seen her say or do anything that was truly bad or malevolent. Don't get me wrong, she wasn't some kind of holier-than-thou kind of person. She was honestly very down to earth, but also maintained what I can only call moral excellence. The story goes like this. Me and Lola were hanging out after school one day. We had been on the track on one of those days where there wasn't any track practice. A lot of us kids hung out there for some reason. We were talking with some of our other friends, and the topic shifted to this one guy that we all had an economics class with. His name was Albert, and he was the kind of guy that you knew he was labeled a loser in high school the second you saw him. He had this really greasy hair that really needed to be cut. He had a patchy beard that always looked like he had just eaten a meal and got all over his face, and he always wore these really weird anime t-shirts to school. The only reason I even knew of his existence was because he answered questions really weird in class. There was this one time when the economics teacher called on him to answer the question the class had been working on. At first, he whispered the answer and nobody heard him. The teacher told him to speak up, and then he screamed, 42. The entire class went quiet for a minute. We just kind of looked at him for a minute. One guy started laughing, but he was the only one to do so. The rest of us were all kind of freaked out. Anyway, suffice to say, Albert had a really rough time in high school. One of our other friends started making fun of Albert as we were walking around the track. Lola got really offended and started defending him, saying that he wasn't that bad or weird. She went on this rant about how everyone is a little weird in their own way and that we shouldn't make fun of people. I stopped going on about it. I don't like to be the kind of guy that makes fun of others, but sometimes it can be really hard to stop yourself in the right crowd. But some of our other friends just kept going. They just told Lola that it's not hurting anyone. She didn't take too kindly to this. Lola got really annoyed and left. I was much closer with her than I was anyone else there, so I went with her. We're going back to the car, and she asked me why I made fun of Albert. I tried to explain that I really didn't mean to. Sometimes I just don't think about those kinds of things. She told me that she wanted to be alone. I could tell that she was pretty upset about the whole thing. I didn't live all that far, so I just walked back home. Well, the next day in economics, we had a partner project. I always hated those, but it wasn't too bad because I normally got to work with Lola. But not this time. When the teacher told us to find a partner, Lola went right over to Albert. I'm pretty sure he was always the person that either had to work by themselves or get randomly matched up with someone else who didn't have a partner. I got really annoyed with Lola because this man I had to get partnered with was one of the dumbest people in class. A couple of times during class, I looked over and noticed that they were both laughing and having a good time. I walked up to Lola after class and asked her why she had abandoned me. She told me that she felt bad for Albert and it wasn't right that he got ignored and roasted by everyone in school. I told her that was fine and dandy and everything, but you shouldn't abandon your own friends to make sure that the weird kid fits in. She got kind of annoyed at this and walked off. And that was the day that she started hanging out with Albert on a regular basis. It was really weird. I was honestly kind of annoyed that I sort of lost my best friend to the weirdest kid in school. I still talked to Lola when I could, but we didn't hang out as much as we had used to after this. That was until things between her and Albert started getting weird even for her. She started telling me that he really wanted her to become his girlfriend. After a couple of weeks, she showed me the text messages that he would send her, and I'm not gonna lie, they were freaky. He talked about wanting to do all this really weird stuff to her. He even bought her a furry costume. He sent her a picture of it, and it was this purple fox in a bikini. That was hands down the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life. She tried to back off because she told me that Albert was honestly a lot to handle. She said that he was a nice guy, just really creepy and overbearing. I told her that's what she gets for hanging out with a weird kid. Things got really bad when the rumors started, and it went like this. Everyone had already been talking about Albert and Lola getting married over spring break. Lola told me multiple times that she never did anything with Albert. He grossed her out. But that doesn't ever stop the rumors, does it? Well, I guess Albert had this laptop in class one day and was looking at pictures of Lola on it. The only reason we knew was because the girl that was sitting behind him took a video with her over his shoulder without him noticing. It went on for about 40 seconds, and Albert was just sitting there staring at all of these pictures of Lola doing various things. But here's the weird part. There was at least one of the pictures that looks like it was taken at school without Lola even realizing it. Everyone started sending this video file to each other, and it wasn't long before everyone knew. People started making fun of him for being a stalker, and honestly, from what Lola has told me, he kind of was stalking her in a lot of ways. I guess the situation had finally escalated enough that Lola had had enough. She texted Albert that she didn't want to be friends with him anymore, and was really creeped out that he was sitting around looking at pictures of her like that in class. And this is why I firmly believe that good people finish last. Because Albert ended his own life the next day. The news shocked the community, and no one was more upset about it than Lola was. And the following day, she talked about how she was responsible, and she was the reason that he had done this to himself. I even heard a rumor that she had called 911 on herself because she felt so guilty about the whole thing. Of course, she never got in trouble for anything, obviously. She never did anything wrong to Albert. She just didn't want to do this weird furry stuff with him. And this all happened when we were seniors in high school. It's been about 2 years now since it all went down, and it's been really rough. Me and Lola don't talk anymore. A few weeks after Albert ended his life, she stopped talking to everyone. She basically dropped off the face of the earth. The last I heard was that she was still living at home and never left her bedroom. I've tried reaching out to her a couple of times, but she doesn't want to have anything to do with me. The saddest part is knowing that she's one of the nicest and smartest people I've ever met in my life. She was only trying to do the right thing, and because of Albert's selfishness, her life might have been ruined forever. My brother is 3 years younger than me. He's always been a bit of a goofball, never really took anything very seriously, and managed to have more fun than anyone I've ever known. Growing up, everything always seemed to work out in his favor. He never had to take responsibility for things, and even when he made horrible mistakes, he always managed to come out without a scratch on him. The story happened about 6 months ago. It's really sad, but I think talking about it really helps. My brother and I have been going to the same college. We both happen to like engineering, and we live 20 minutes away from one of the best engineering colleges in the state. It was a no-brainer that we ended up going there together. Growing up, he always was the popular one with a lot of friends. I was kind of a loner, but here's the thing. His friends were all fake. He hung out with the worst people you could imagine. They didn't lift him up, make him feel good, brighten his day. They were only there when things were good, and they always left my brother's life worse than when they came. This was the second semester of my junior year, and I was really working hard to finish up my degree. I was taking a lot of credit hours to try to graduate a semester early. Even though it was an in-state college and fairly affordable, it was still a lot of money to go there. My brother just so happened to have graduated high school a semester early, and this was his first semester in college. He was smart enough that he didn't have to study all that much in high school, and he really struggles with his classes in the beginning. We weren't in any of each other's classes, but we did ride to and from college together most days and occasionally played video games together on the weekend. Our favorite thing to play was Halo 3. We were always both nostalgic over the good old days of Xbox. We would normally play the campaign on Legendary with some of the skulls activated. We would also occasionally 1v1. I don't know where he found her, but he managed to get a girlfriend. He must have met her on Tinder or something. They started spending all of their time together, and he dove headfirst really fast. He stopped hanging out with me at all, and he spent all of his time with her. It was about 3 weeks into the relationship that he told us they wanted to get married. My mom tried talking some sense into him. My dad yelled at him for being so naive and stupid. He was literally a college freshman, and this was his first real girlfriend. Well, it was only about 2 weeks later when they hit a rough patch. They had some kind of argument over who was going to pay for lunch. From what he told me, it sounded like they really got into it. The saddest part about the whole situation, that it was literally a $12 meal at McDonald's. They started having really bad arguments in general, and a lot of it went back to this whole who's paying for lunch thing. I know how ridiculous this might sound, but it totally went down like this. They literally fight over some of the dumbest stuff I've ever heard of in my life, and it was at that point that I realized how emotionally immature my brother and his girl actually were. Well, as all young relationships like this tend to do, they eventually broke up. But here's the catch. This girl went back to her previous boyfriend and broke up with my brother. This left him in a really weird headspace. He's normally not the kind of guy that cries, but his room is right next to mine, and I definitely heard him cry every night for a couple of weeks. I knew that he was taking things pretty badly, but things were about to get worse. He started hanging out with more of those bad friends I was telling you about earlier, and a lot of these guys were high school dropouts or older without jobs. Most of them smoked, which is highly illegal in our state, and some of them even used harder drugs than that. One dealer in that friend group owns a really nice house on Main Street in the town and pays for it in cash with his drug money. He doesn't even have a way to launder his money, and if you're wondering, every person in this friend group had this kind of recklessness about them. It wasn't long before my brother didn't want to ride together to college. He didn't give me a good reason. He just said that he wanted some independence and alone time, and I didn't think anything of it. Me and him slowly but surely started to drift apart. We talked twice as less, and he became even more unreliable and unstable as things went forward. I now know that he stopped going to class altogether. Didn't even bother to officially drop out or anything. He just stopped going. He spent all of his time with these sleazy friends of his doing God only knows what, and through it all, he still regularly talked about his ex-girlfriend. I found that really strange. At one point, my curiosity got the better of me, and I wanted to try to find a way to help him. I tried having a couple of heart-to-heart talks with him, but nothing got through to him. He just didn't care anymore. That was when I had the idea to go into his room to understand what was really going on. I know I shouldn't have, but I really had no idea what else I could do about the situation. I went in there one day when he claimed that he was going to class. I searched for about a half hour and didn't really find anything too interesting or incriminating. I found his stash. He didn't even have it hidden really well. He literally had a hat on his table and it was under the hat. That was until I started looking around his computer. I went onto the documents and saw that he had a folder with the name of his ex-girlfriend. I clicked on it and found the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. It was literally hundreds of pictures of this girl. I mean hundreds of them. Some of them were from when they had been dating, some of them were from Facebook, and others were apparently at her random locations. Sometimes there were even pictures of her with this other boyfriend. I got really freaked out and concerned, and that was when I noticed another folder called Edited Pics. I clicked on it and saw some of the strangest stuff that I've ever seen in my life. I guess that my brother had photoshopped his and her head onto adult film stars. The craziest part was that it looked fairly believable. I had to look for a few minutes before I even realized that they weren't actually real. I was surprised that he had gotten so good at Photoshop, but also mortified at what he was doing with his newfound skill. The creepiest part is that some of the pictures were him and his ex-girlfriend getting it on while there would be a dog or something in the background watching, and he photoshopped the other guy's head onto the dog. I mean, literally, what the heck? I was so freaked out, and I really wished that I hadn't looked at any of that stuff because I had no idea what to do. I couldn't go to my parents with this stuff, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to talk to him about it either. Well, it's been 6 months since all of that happened. He never quite got his act together. He continued hanging out with these sketchy friends of his, and he got addicted to some stronger things. I'm not exactly sure why, but it was bad enough that my very caring and forgiving mother kicked him out of the house. I was extremely surprised that she had done this, but I guess I can't blame her because she had caught him with some harder stuff in the house on multiple occasions. I haven't talked to my brother since he got kicked out, and I have no idea what he's been up to since. Even now, I still have no clue what possessed him to take things to such an extreme. Maybe he had some kind of underlying mental illness, and that was why he reacted the way he did. Whatever the case, I know he's just not a part of our lives anymore. I do really hope that he's doing better now, though. It was around 1983, I think, when my family had our first trip to Cape Cod. Somewhere around Cape Cod, at least. I won't be too specific. I've learned the hard way to keep details like that to myself. I must have been around 10 or 11, and whilst for the first couple of weeks swimming in the ocean, seafood and ice cream kept me entertained, before long I grew pretty bored. I was an only child, and an awkward one at that, and so I had no one to pass the time with whilst my parents read or shopped or carried out one of any number of adult activities which would bore a child to tears. Which is why, when we were taking our usual morning walk along the beach, I spied a brown bottle with something inside of it, and I was beyond excited. I remember running towards it, tearing ahead of my parents, digging through the seaweed and throwing aside empty crab shells to get at it. There it was, an actual message in a bottle. I couldn't make out what it said exactly, but the shape of a rolled-up piece of paper was unmistakable. I remember crouching there, desperately trying to force the cork out with my tiny hands as the cold sea lapped at my feet. I couldn't get it open, and managed to persuade my parents to take it back to the house we'd rented to open it. It ended up proving so difficult to open that we ended up having to use a knife, slowly chipping parts of the cork out of the neck of the bottle until the rest of it fell inside. The paper was tied tight with string, and when we tipped the bottle upside down, the roll slid out, alongside the cork dust. It took me a while to read it. Deciphering the awful handwriting took a while, but eventually I got there. It was from another child. Their name was Robbie, and they said that they were bored this summer and sent out several of these messages from their dad's fishing boat to see if they'd get any responses. They gave an address and asked a few questions. I can still remember the question now. At the time, they seemed so innocent, the sort of questions you might ask a pen pal. How old I was, what did I look like, what was my name, was I a boy or a girl? I don't know if my parents had a discussion about whether or not I could write to Robbie, but I do remember them supporting my letter writing the next morning, going with me to buy stationery from the store and helping me when I found a word that I struggled to spell. I thought my summer was saved. Suddenly, it all didn't feel so lonely. The knowledge that somewhere out there across the country, miles and miles and miles away, was a boy just like me, bored and looking for a friend. It was so electrifyingly cool. We went as a family to post the letter, and for the next few days I'd check the post as soon as I woke up, even though my parents said my letter probably hadn't even arrived yet. But he did reply, quickly. He said I sounded like fun and that he was glad someone had found the bottle because he hadn't had any other responses and was beginning to think that it must have sunk or gotten lost in a storm somewhere. Me and Robbie talked all summer, and even when I moved back from the holiday home into our usual home, we stayed in contact. We became friends. He told me about his life and I told him about mine. We shared secrets and tips for all sorts of things. How to build a slingshot, the best candy combinations, how to do tricks on your bike. It was easier, I think, through letters, to be honest. I'd always struggled with kids my age, but with Robbie there was an element removed. He was honest with me as well, which I think helped. He'd tell me about all of his childish insecurities and the fact that his parents didn't talk to him much, and he'd ask if mine talked to me much. He said that he hadn't told his dad about the bottles, but in fact had slipped them overboard when his dad wasn't looking, and asked me if my mom or dad knew about him. I told him that they did, sure, but they didn't know exactly what I was saying. I do remember that he started to ask stranger and stranger questions that weren't appropriate for kids our age. He asked if I ever looked at boys the same way I looked at girls, and would sometimes ask questions about my body. What it looked like, what swimming costume I'd wear, stuff like that. He began to get more and more intense, especially when my replies slowed down due to school. He'd tell me these weird stories about things older boys had done to him, like how they stripped him naked and made him bathe in a puddle, and that he'd ask me what I thought. He'd tell me that he thought about me a lot and that he didn't have any friends but me, and that sometimes he'd imagine what it would be like to play with me. It began to creep me out a little bit, although at the time I couldn't really explain why, and I remember writing a letter to him telling him that unfortunately I wouldn't be able to keep writing to him, and that I had too much going on at school. It was the next letter that changed everything. His next letter was angry and mean, and his handwriting had changed almost entirely. It had gone from sloppy scrawl of a child to a tighter cursive script. He said that he thought I was better than that, and that friends didn't just ditch each other, and said that we should meet up soon if we couldn't write. He said that he could probably make it to my city fairly soon and that we should go somewhere, just the two of us, like the pier or for a walk. I know most of the details because after I was an adult, my parents finally told me everything. See, all I remember is leaving that letter out on the kitchen table, and then the next day having to talk to a few men in funny outfits. I remember them asking me all sorts of questions, and my mom crying, and my dad giving me a big hug and telling me to be honest. They'd found the letter on the kitchen, and alarm bells had immediately started ringing. My dad had wasted no time in calling the police and telling them that they thought a predator was targeting his son, and he gave them the exact address that he'd been writing from. They wasted no time in investigating and apparently discovered that I hadn't been talking to a boy my age at all, but a much, much older man. In fact, when they ended up searching his house, they found that he had been in contact with dozens and dozens of kids just like me, and that he'd stuck their letters up all over the walls of his room. There were other details my parents obviously left out, and occasionally whilst telling me the story, they'd made a face as if though they were consciously avoiding something uncomfortable. Apparently it was his MO to leave messages in bottles overnight on popular beaches across the country, using his left hand to write the messages, and then waiting for overexcited kids to reply. My parents never told me if he'd met any of the other kids he'd been talking to, and I haven't ever really wanted to find out. All I know is that whilst I don't think I ever would have met up with him, there were moments where I really believed that Robbie was my friend, and felt a little less alone. And I know that all it would have taken would have been a moment like that, and I'd have considered it. A bad day at school, an argument with my parents, and I might have biked my way to the pier to meet Robbie, to meet the only friend I thought I had. What really creeps me out is that he knew the whole time where I lived. He didn't live too far away either, and sometimes I wonder if he ever parked outside my house and watched, or if he ever followed me without me knowing. It wouldn't have been hard, and I'd have no way of knowing. Sometimes even now I'm an adult and have kids of my own, I'll find myself watching a figure in a parked car, heart racing, through my blinds until I'm sure that they've left. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. I enjoyed my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.